Good afternoon.
Hi, Leanne. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Excellent.
That's
So let's
good.
jump right in. This is an interesting topic, and it's called gray divorce, which is really just a fancy or marketing term, really to describe what has been a growing trend. And it once used to be that divorce was a taboo, and it rarely happened. And if it did happen, it was hush hush. Then it became that divorce was really just part of normal day life, and people get married, people get divorced. And then as time went forward, we started seeing an increase in the number of people that were getting a divorce after the age of 55, which is a very particular point in someone's life, because generally at 55, if people have lived together as a married couple, they probably were together for at least 20 years, and they probably had children, and they probably had children that by the time they were 55 were out of the house, graduated university, maybe started their own lives. So it was a very peculiar station in life for people in their 50s or later to get a divorce. But it was happening. Many of us started theorizing, why would that be the case? And I mean, some of our viewers and you, Leanne, might guess why. One reason was that after spending their entire married life building careers, building wealth, raising children, the children are out of the house. Now they look at each other and say, who are you? And what kind of life are we currently having now that we don't have all of these other activities that we were partners in, like building careers, buying and selling houses, renovating houses, taking the children to programs, doing their homework, parent-teacher meetings, graduations. And so some people were finding that the couple were looking at each other, realizing they had a very empty relationship because the things that held them together were no longer there. When I was the chair of the family law section at the Ontario Bar Association, I was receiving quite a few calls from lawyers who were asking for direction on how to deal with what was really elder divorce, the divorce of people that were now in their 70s and sometimes even 80s. And so when I was getting these calls, I really didn't have a place to deal with them, because we really at the family law level, we're dealing with divorces that generally occurred between ages 20 and 50, not between 50 and 80. So I, along with a bunch of other colleagues, decided to create a new section of the law called elder law. And in the last 5 years, it's been a growing area, the area called elder law. And a subset of elder law is the divorce within the sector of senior citizens or seniors. So today's subject is, what is a gray divorce, and how is it, quite frankly, any different than a non-gray divorce? So let me ask you, Leanne, have you represented, or have you had consultations with people that were north of 55?
Definitely both. I have clients who are north of 55, and I've had consultations from those in over 55 as well. And, it's not uncommon. And, you touched upon, one of the main reasons is, people perhaps just growing apart as life goes on. And, I sort of tied within that, I think another common reason is that, there are people out there who, always say that they're staying together because of the children. And, they reach that point where children are now out of the home, either in university or even, beyond that stage. And so, true to their word, they aren't going to stay together for the children now, because the children are not in the home. And so I think that's a phenomena that goes on with it as well. But, in my view, there are some unique aspects to it that make it different from a divorce with people in other age brackets. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that and what you've found with your clients.
Yeah, so it's an interesting question to know. How is the gray divorce different than all other divorces. And so I can tell you, having done quite a bit of work with seniors who are divorcing, from a legal standpoint, when you think about the topics are parenting, support, and property division. So when you're dealing with seniors, you're no longer dealing with parenting anymore, although it gets interesting because there's a lot of seniors who are in a caregiving role to their grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And so the law was amended just about 5 years ago to specifically label the rights of grandparents to what was once called custody and access, which is now called parenting time. So although I would have liked to say the subject of parenting is removed from the gray divorce, it actually is not. If anything, it's actually quite relevant today, particularly in situations where the adult children are divorcing and one of them moves in with their senior parents, who then take on a caregiving role. So by the way, that is one unique element of the gray divorce.
And they're also, with respect to parenting, sorry just to jump in, but before you leave the parenting topic, there can be situations too where there's an adult child who has developmental delay types of issues or mental health issues or different things, and so isn't able to live on their own and take care of themselves. I mean, there's adult children where, you know, child support is still being paid because of you know, developmental, you know, issues that child has or other causes. And so that can factor in. I had a client where we were dealing with a gray divorce, and an adult child who wasn't self-sufficient, and so there were arguments about child support.
Absolutely, and for the benefit of our viewers, this is one of the most common questions that we divorce lawyers are asked. Wait for it, viewers. When does child support end? That's like the classic question. You'll have those that will say, oh, of course, when the child's 18 years old. You'll have those who will say, well, no, when the child graduates from college or university. The short answer is, it's exactly what you said, Leanne, which is, what is the termination for child support under Ontario and provincial law? And the answer is, when a child is no longer a dependent child. And children could be 80 years old. So the law says this: a child is no longer a child entitled to child support when they cease to be a child as defined by the legislation, and the legislation defines a child as someone who is unable to be economically independent by reason of education, disability, or some other cause. Again, the definition: education, disability, or some other cause. And we've had cases, you and I, where the children, they might be 30, 40, 50 years old, and they have either mental health or physical disabilities that prevent them from being economically independent, and therefore they remain a child of the marriage. Okay, so let's go back to the other factors. So not parenting, or yes, parenting, depending on how you look at it. Then you've got support and property division. Now, some people remain together because of the economic ties they have with one another. But once they reach their 50s, 60s, 70s, they reach a point where they're now living off of retirement savings. So it's no longer a situation where one is earning and the other one isn't, or there's an income disparity, because now they might actually be living off of RRSPs, RIFs, or pension income. And in that, or quite frankly, in some of the lower income cases, old age security or CPP. So in that situation, the desperation that leads to people to remain together is no longer, because now they can turn to a lawyer and say, what are my legal rights? Well, the answer is they're going to simply divide the retirement savings in half and go their separate ways. And each of them is going to rely on whether it's CPP, old age, or a division of the pension benefits, or a division of their RRSPs and RIFs. So whatever it is, they actually are now, at the first point in their life, able to divide everything equally without having the headache of trying to figure out how much support should be paid or otherwise. So it's actually a moment in time that creates financial freedom, if you could believe such a thing. Divorce can actually create financial freedom because now they're in their 60s or 70s and they're able to say, you know what, neither of us are working anymore. We simply are going to sell the house, divide everything in half, and go our separate ways. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it's at that moment in time where there is a monumental shift in the value system between the two spouses. Up until that point in time, they may have both been very busy building their family wealth, taking care of their children, focused on the partnership called the family. But now that the children are out of the house, now that their economic obligations to the children have ended, now they could say, well, hold on a second. I've always wanted to live in Collingwood and live a much more meager lifestyle and maybe farm or build a garden, whereas the other person wants to live in downtown Toronto and go and see Raptors games and go to the concerts. So now their value systems are very different. One might want to travel, the other one might want to spend all of their time with their grandchildren. So the value system becomes this sort of division where now they're thinking, well, hold on a second, the life that I've waited to live at this moment in my life is not the same life that my husband or my wife wants to live. And so I'd like to go my separate way. And that's where the very remedies involved in the Great Divorce are driven by a choice of lifestyle that is very different than the other person. And the thing that held them together, whether it was the children or economics, is no longer.
Although sometimes, the economic piece can actually end up being much worse, because, the Great Divorce is typically, the era where each party's earning capacity is, at its lowest. That's why we have RRSPs and RIFs, and there's tax, advantages to taking your money out of your RRSP when you're at that age, because you're not in your highest income earning years. And so what I've seen is I've had clients where, at least one of the parties was a high income earner for many years, but they were also spenders. And so they were living a very lovely lifestyle, but it was really all debt financed and they were spending money as fast as it was being earned. And then suddenly this high income earner, wants to get a divorce and is of retirement age and is retiring. And, that can so not only are they having the drastic change of the lowered income because of retirement, they're also having the drastic change of lower income because they're divorcing, and you've each got only, however the support's going to play out. But, I found that retirement is a big factor that comes into play with these great divorces, because, sometimes someone is not quite, sometimes somebody all their life, they plan to retire at age 60 or at age 55. And that was what they always planned. And then suddenly at 53 or 54, they're getting a divorce and they still want to be able to retire early. And the other spouse is saying, no, wait a minute here. You can't retire at 55 or at 60. You need to work longer. You've got responsibilities to me, and I want spousal support, and I want that support to be at the income that you were earning all of those years that you are currently earning. And, it can play a huge role that way. So sometimes people who, did plan to have early retirement, it doesn't always work out that way if you end up in a great divorce situation.
100%. And you've identified one of many of the negatives. I started with some of the positives, i.e. the ability to now divide all of their net worth and then live the life that they want to lead without being bound to a different life that their spouse wants to lead. But you've identified one of the downsides. One of our viewers writes, sometimes these clients seem less adaptable to life changes. Bingo, that's a big factor.
Yeah.
And let me tell you this is where there's similarity to the non-great divorce to the great divorce. Here's a similarity. Most of the time in all divorces, the divorce is triggered by one person, most of the time. Rarely does divorce happen as a result of both people at the exact same moment in time in their life saying, you know what, we both have arrived at the conclusion that we should no longer be together anymore. In the gray divorce, no different than in the non-gray divorce, oftentimes one person goes to the other and says, you know what, I've made a decision. I want to leave this marriage for whatever the reasons might be. And when that happens, it's oftentimes a rude awakening and a tremendous rupture, not only in the relationship, but in the life that the left behind spouse knew to be. The left behind spouse oftentimes never saw it coming, whereas the one that makes the announcement has been living with it, thinking about it, possibly planning it for days, weeks, months, years, sometimes even decades. And so the person that announces the intention to separate may very well be mentally and emotionally prepared to go their own way. But the other person is shocked and in a state of awe, not knowing what to do with that news. And so it could actually be very devastating. And in fact, the social science literature seems to suggest that the people that are together long into their retirement years in consensual, happy, amicable marriages tend to outlive the people that are apart or living in marriages where they're unhappy. And so the corollary of that is the person that is left behind, statistically speaking, has a lower life expectancy because of the hurt, the sadness, the depression, and the emptiness that they struggle with, irrespective of all of the economic implications of that. So
I was going to say, interesting is on that sort of topic as well, is that I think the research also shows that sort of in later in life, it's often single women are the happiest group, and married men are the happiest group for men. So single women for females are, research shows, happier, however they're defining happiness, and married men are the most happy of males. So that's kind of an interesting thing. I don't know how that reflects in necessarily.
And by the way, on the subject of single women later in life, I have two comments on that. And again, these are broad generalizations, and it differs not only from city to city, from country to country, from ethnicity to ethnicity. Clearly, you can't make one broad statement about all women in their 70s and 80s, but one thing is more commonplace, and that is women tend to find social systems to be part of later in life, whereas men become more reclusive and less socially connected. And these are factors that definitely influence longevity and life expectancy. Yeah. But going back to the economics of it, about 12 years ago, Ontario changed its pension laws to allow pensions to be divided at source. And that was one of the factors that actually made separation and divorce of seniors easier. So if one person, I'm making this up, was a teacher for 35 years and developed a very healthy pension, up until the change in the laws, it was impossible to properly divide that pension up at source. But as a result of changes to the Family Law Act and the Pension Benefits Act, that pension could be divided at source, which would allow each of the spouses to separately be able to draw down on that pension upon retirement, which didn't exist before. And that was one factor that actually made it simpler for gray divorces to properly equalize the assets. And the interesting thing is, it allowed for the possibility, but not the likelihood, of double dipping. What is double dipping? Double dipping is where you divide the pension at source, but then later in life, later when the pension is actually drawn down, if there still is an imbalance in the income of the two sides, even though the pension was already equalized, there are scenarios under which the higher income earner could be required to pay support to the lower income earner from the pension that was already equalized. Like I said, It's not likely, but it's possible. And please, for the viewers, do not accept this as legal advice. Every case needs to be assessed on its own merits.
Yeah, but if you are dealing with a pension situation, it's a good idea to get legal advice because of that very issue. You want to make sure you don't get into some situation where you've agreed to a double dipping type situation. And the legislation, I think, has helped a lot. I have a lot of, I think, as you know, Steve, I have a lot of clients who are police officers. And of course, the police do have, other than teachers, like they're one of the other organizations that have very nice pensions, and pensions can be very large. I mean, next to the matrimonial home, or sometimes it could depend. It could be more than the matrimonial home, and so it is a very important asset, particularly in these great divorces.
And let me connect the dots to our last session and this session. I recently had a case. It settled in the early stages of a trial whereby the pension had accumulated over the course of about 40 years by the person that worked. And the marriage was only for a small fraction of that period. So my client was entitled to an equalization of the pension, but only for the years of marriage, not for the totality of their cohabitation, and certainly not for the totality of the existence of the pension. And so in this situation, we will be in a situation where there may very well be a double dip, in that she is receiving half of the pension value for the period of the marriage, but she will be likely receiving support far beyond just the amount of the marital period, because the size of the pension is far greater and the duration of support obligations and entitlement is far greater. So it's a very confusing conundrum that most certainly does require legal advice to understand.
Now, I feel we would be remiss to be talking about this topic and to not bring up Bill and Melinda Gates, since they are probably the most obvious newsworthy great divorce that's currently going on. And it seems that since, from what I've seen in the media, since it's been announced, all of a sudden this started, trickles coming out about, Bill's behavior with women. And, it started to look like maybe he'd, been a serial cheater, and he'd been inappropriate with women in the workplace. And, we heard none of this, while they were together at all. And, it would seem like it seems like they're working through, you're not hearing, a lot of fighting about the money and, things like that. But I'm wondering what, so I wouldn't call their divorce like a highly acrimonious one, although, you never know where things might turn. And then Jeff Bezos, which was another one, his divorce was very quiet and seamless. And so in your experience with great divorces, Steve, do you find your clients have been more amicable and more liable to, come to an agreement and mediate, or, just negotiate through lawyers? Or have you found them to generally to be a high conflict type of divorce?
No, in my experiences, the conflict is lower because many of the cases involving high conflict involve parental disputes, which tend to polarize people. You see, in the field of divorce law, you've got financial disputes and non-financial disputes. The non-financial disputes generally tend to be related to the parenting of children, generally speaking, minor children. And so some people will spend unreasonable sums of money fighting over custody and parenting of children. But when they are faced with significant legal bills as up against, juxtaposed to, the rewards of the divorce litigation, now they're much more intellectual about it. Nobody wants to spend $10 to get $5. And so in the gray divorce scenario, it tends to be very much a financial settlement or a financial goal. And there is a much more, let's just say, economically prudent approach to resolving it. That's number one. Reason number two, people who are older, generally speaking, are more mature and they're wiser with their use of money. Third reason is they've got a very finite amount of money, whereas people who divorce younger in life might be thinking, well, I've got a much greater horizon to earn. People in the gray zone recognize that there is a very small window of time to recoup losses as a result of spending it foolishly on a divorce, and are less likely to see them lose wealth in favor of a divorce litigation or a divorce conflict. So there's a variety of reasons for that, but generally speaking, let me add one more. In the gray divorce, whereas in the non-gray divorce, you've got minor children who are the subjects of the divorce. In the gray divorce, you've got adult children who are the facilitators of their parents' divorce. Meaning, I've had many gray divorce cases where my meeting with my client is with my client and 2, 3, or 4 of the adult children and their spouses, who in some cases line up behind one or both parents to assist them in doing this in a way that respects the privacy of the family, respects the wealth that needs to be preserved within the family, and also the adult children do not want a war between their senior parents, so they become involved in it as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of those and have found the same thing. They tend to be less conflict oriented and more practical. The gray divorcees tend to be more practical about things, and that makes things much easier as a lawyer. Because you're just focused on numbers, and the law is more clear cut when it comes to numbers. It's things like parenting and who gets to make decisions and schedules where there's no science to it in particular. So money issues can always be easier to solve.
And another thing with the gray divorce, I mean, not all cases are cases of wealthy families like the Gates and the Bezos' families, but in the much lower level of families, particularly with the people that were married and divorced in, say, the last 50 years, in that zone, we have seen significant wealth accumulation in real estate. Mm-hmm. And when that family, when that couple splits up, it's not uncommon for them to have a pension, possibly a cottage, and most likely a home. And when you add those items up, in many cases, there's significant wealth that has been accumulated, partly from hard work, but partly also just from the sheer rise in the value of real estate in the last 20 or 30 years. And so the family that bought a house 30 years ago in North York, that house is worth significantly more with no mortgage on it than it was when they originally bought the house. So why do I mention this? In the gray divorce, it actually affords the family an opportunity to do retirement and estate planning in a way that they never imagined before, because now the husband and the wife may very well be dividing all those assets, and now they have to think about how are they going to deal with the next generation now that they're dividing it up. Whereas in the historical case, they don't think about that. They just simply create matching wills that says everything goes to the children in equal shares or otherwise. But now they actually have to think in their 50s, 60s, and 70s, how am I going to deal with, I'm only ending up with half. I'm not going to end up using all of my half because it's greater than what they need. Now they have to think about how they're going to deal with this from an estate planning section. And each spouse gets to do their own thing with their own money. And that affords them an opportunity to do some planning that they couldn't or wouldn't do otherwise.
No, that's very true. Well, I think we've covered the topic well. It's an important one, and it's one that affects a lot of people. So I'm glad we were able to touch on it this week. Thanks, Steve, and thank you to our listeners for tuning in. And we will be back next week with another topic.
Very good. Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye.